Welcome back, FPC Scott, 2025, the first podcast of the year. We're picking up back in the book of Romans where we left off in 2024. Last podcast we had gone through Romans 4 and 13, so today we're going to be picking up with Romans chapter 4 and verse 14. And it says, "For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect." The Living Bible would read this way: "So if you still claim that God's blessings go to those who are good enough, then you are saying that God's promises to those who have faith are meaningless and faith is foolish." So we find Paul explaining that if the Jews could become heirs by obeying the law, then our faith has no value. And Paul is forcing his readers to choose between the righteousness completed by faith based on God's grace and righteousness completed by a knowledge of the law, which would have made Israel more righteous than the Gentiles, regardless of faith, since they had received the law and they were the ones that the law was given to. And so, if this is the case, then their faith would have been made empty. If people are justified by the law, they cannot be justified faith, and then the faith would be useless, is what Paul is arguing. And he's also arguing that the promise is worthless, that it has been made invalid. The law that the Jews were given brings wrath. The law keeps on producing wrath, and as a consequence of disobeying the law. Because we've talked about it many times throughout the previous podcasts, no one can fully keep the law. God, in wrath against sin, he judges those who disobey. And we cannot fully keep the law, so if that would be the case, then we are always going to be in the wrath of God. And in verse 14, Paul is discussing God's promises to Abraham, his offspring, and to all the Jewish people. And when we talk about these promises, these are the promises that can be found in Genesis chapter 12, starting at verse 1. And it says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, into a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." And verse 3 says, "And I will bless them that bless thee, curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." So those promises mean that Israel is the heir of the world. And now Paul is showing that this inheritance will not come by following the law. Those promises were given centuries before the law ever existed. And Paul writes that if the inheritance is to be given to those who follow the law, then our faith really doesn't matter at all. But there's even a bigger problem with this thought, and is that the promises of God don't matter, because not all of Abraham's descendants had the law. And Paul has already shown that no one can fully keep the law. The scripture says in Romans 3 and 10 that all have sinned and fall short of God's glory. 3 and 10, Romans says, "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one." Romans 3 and 23 would say, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." So if God's promises to Israel are only for those who follow the law, then no one's going to receive them, because we cannot follow the law. So if those promises are only for those that can fully follow the law, then the promises would never be received by anyone. When the law serves as the requirement for salvation, then faith serves no purpose. The next verse would say, Romans 4 and 15, because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. And the Living Bible would read this way, but the fact of the matter is this: when we try to gain God's blessings and salvation by keeping his laws, we always end up under his anger, for we always fail to keep them. The only way we can keep from breaking laws is not to have any to break. That's think about that. The only way that a law will not get broken is if there's no law to begin with. So in Paul's view, Moses' law served the function of revealing the law rather than canceling sin. If following the law was the condition that needed to be met for righteousness to be received, then not one person, not even Abraham, would have met those requirements. The law's job was to define sin. When man creates a law, it's to define a crime. So the law is created to define something, whether it's a sin in God's eyes, or if it's a moral law or a physical law or whatever law that man writes, whether it be thou shalt not steal is both God's law, but it's also a man's law. So these laws were written to identify a sin or something that someone did that was wrong. And when the law was broken, God saw the sin, God saw the law that was broken, and then God was to judge the sin. There was nothing written into the law about mercy for the law being broken. There was nothing written in the Ten Commandments that says, oh, there's mercy if you break this law because of this circumstance. The law was the law, and the law was to be followed. And if the law was broken, then that was sin. When the law was broken, wrath or punishment was the required result, not mercy. And Paul is stating a general principle: where there is no law, there is no transgression. Where there is no law, the law cannot be broken. So the law, rather than being a pathway to a blessing, actually it brings about God's wrath, because it reveals sin without offering redemption. The law's presence shines a light on sin. It illuminates sin. And it amplifies our shortcomings. It makes our shortcomings more aware. And it results in a state of condemnation, especially because no one person can perfectly keep the law. And so what this would mean is that the law's purpose is to highlight our shortcomings. And it was to lead to condemnation because of the fact that everybody would have their shortcomings highlighted, and everybody would be led to condemnation because no one followed the law perfectly. And the verse emphasizes that faith, rather than following the law, is essential for salvation. Paul said in the previous verse that God's promises to Abraham and his descendants, Israel, are worthless if they depend on Israel following the law of Moses. The first reason is that the promises were made long before the law existed. And the second one, which was mentioned several times already, is no one is able to keep that law. So the promises would be empty promises, because receiving the promises was based on a condition that they could not meet. Many of Abraham's descendants never even had the law. And even if those who had it would have had it, they would have not been able to keep it. Moving on to the next verse, Romans 4 and 16, it says, therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. The Living Bible would say, so God's blessings are given to us by faith as a free gift. We are certain to get them whether or not we follow Jewish customs, if we have faith like Abraham's. For Abraham is the father of us all when it comes to these matters of faith. So Paul is telling his readers that both those of faith, the Gentiles, and those who come to a knowledge of God through the law, the Jews, are heirs to these promises. So if we break down this verse in sections, it says, therefore. So what Paul is stating is that he has come to this conclusion. This is what Paul has concluded based on all that he's teaching, that it is of faith, or that would mean that there is justification by faith. The plan which God has made for the saving of us is by faith. The next phrase says that it might be by grace, only through undeserved mercy. If people were justified by law, it would be by their own merits. But now it is of an unmerited faith. It's something that we didn't earn, but that it is given to the end. So that would mean that this is the purpose that God has done this. This is why God has done this. The scripture says the promise might be sure, or it would say that it might be established. It could not be established on any other grounds if it had depended on completely following the law. The promise would have never been established because no one would have been able to have complete obedience to the law. And the scripture says to all the seeds, so that is to all of his heirs, not to that only. Not only to that part of his descendants who were Jews or who had the law, but to that. It is for all who would have the same faith as Abraham, of all who believe, whether they be a Jew or they be a Gentile. And Paul restates this in this verse, what he said in the previous verses, but this time he describes it from a positive perspective rather than a negative outlook. He's been talking about God's promises to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants. And Paul once again is saying that receiving the promised inheritance is based on faith and not following the law, because it is received by faith and the promises rest on God's grace. So this is very important because no human effort can get us this inheritance. Through our own failures to follow God, we would not be eligible to receive that righteousness, because salvation comes as a gift, and it is guaranteed to all of Abraham's offsprings. Offspring is defined by faith, not by the following of the law. And so Paul has been very careful to show that since Abraham was declared righteous by God for believing God, everyone who comes to God by faith is Abraham's offspring. And this includes both the Jews and the Gentiles who believe in God. In that way, Abraham is the father of all believers. So remember, we cannot fully follow the law. It is not by any human effort, but salvation comes only through faith. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.